A pleasure to meet all at last. And so, we are back at it once again with the likes of TV shows that deserve the spotlight. And after talking a few things about One Day at a Time, it seems only fair that we should follow up with something a little more recent. Basically, an input of the old and then the new. I typically try to have it arranged in a way because there's a good show that some people might remember, or there's something that people might not be familiar with whatsoever. Well, for this instance, what we're going to do here is talk about the somewhat lesser known aspects of the franchise known as Stuart Little. It was at first a popular E.B. White novel published decades ago, but starting in the late 90s, Columbia would come along and bring Stuart Little into live-action cinema in the form of a big trilogy. Stuart Little, as we all know, was the titular mouse whom lived with a human family. It's that kind of situation in which that you have the odd one out of the family that is unfortunately sometimes up for discretion by others, especially the cat, Snowbell, whom was unfortunately in the movies being looked down upon by most. But Stuart is still one whom at least has hope and is the mediator between Snowbell and common enemies that he faces. So while Snowbell has the lows, Stuart Little usually has the highs, even more so than his own human brother, George, whom was famously played by Jonathan Lipnicki, with Snowbell voiced by Nathan Lane, and Stuart himself being voiced by Michael J. Fox. It's a good cast that in and of itself is rounded up by the Little couple, known as Martha and Frederick, whom are played by Gina Davis and Hugh Laurie, respectively. However, with two sequels, and of course, Stuart Little the animated series, which is what we're going to talk about for today, the whole franchise is rounded up with 3 movies, a show, and a number of other forms of media and books. So you could say that this franchise, while somewhat short-lived over the span of 6 to 7 years, it unfortunately doesn't show much signs of returning nowadays, mainly for a number of reasons. Gina Davis going blind, Jonathan Lipnicki basically growing up, Michael J. Fox having Parkinson's disease, and a number of other things that have also unfolded just as well. However, I will say, I do remember watching the Stuart Little animated series over the years, and for a couple of reasons. Because first off, it was a good way to at least attempt to bring about some more lore into the franchise, though not exactly canonical. One could argue, though, that because all 3 movies happen to be set in the present moment each time, they might not entirely affect the timeline whatsoever. However, we can't be too safe to be certain if the animated series should it all be deemed canon. But since I have watched some of the episodes pretty recently to at least refresh my memory about the whole thing, it does seem that it's unfortunate, but I can't say for sure. This might not actually be canon. And when you think about the fact that this came out the following year after Stuart Little 2, which at this point in time still had a number of characters involved. You had the Alley Cats, which of course was led by Smokey. And if we know what happened to them, well, they got dropped into the water, then got out, and supposedly there was a little frisk with a dog. And then of course, in Stuart Little 2, you had the Falcon, whose fate of course was getting hit by the plane and then falling into a trash can, presumably ending up as Monty's snack. So, kind of morbid to think about, but that's just how the movie ended, so moving on though. But we do get some glimpses of these enemies within the show's episodes. One thing that I should note here though is that there is essentially an introductory segment in which that there is a CG variation of animation with Stuart himself. He typically describes these sort of things, and they're essentially sort of like bumpers or ways to welcome the audience in a somewhat warm, inviting way, especially with the ambient music they have in the background and the soft voice that is oftentimes a result of the combination of Miles Jeffrey as well as David Kaufman. Yeah, essentially, Kaufman's voice of Stuart Little and the occasional add-ons from some of the others, it does essentially make for a pretty fitting way to welcome anyone who watches the episodes, including myself. But speaking of Miles Jeffrey, he's mostly known for the voice of George Little, Stuart's brother. But as for the others, it's kind of unfortunate, but we don't exactly have much of their respective roles. Except for Hugh Laurie. He's pretty much one of the only one in the main cast who gets to reprise his role as his own character, Frederick Little, the patriarch of the family. And we do have Jennifer Hale, who was the voice of Martha Little, as well as Eleanor, the younger sister, if you will. There, of course, are others that we should talk about, like Pat Fraley, Kathy Najimy, Quentin Flynn, and even Jeffrey Jones. Yeah, I said that. Funnily enough, this was a year after he was convicted of, well, CP, if you will. But moving on, why don't we go ahead and showcase the episodes real quickly. Now, to tell you the truth, while it might have seemed redundant, the kind of adventures that the Littles had, especially between George, Stuart, and Snowbell, it's an impressive way to go here. They go through a carnival, they race around the park, they also have encounters with some old friends and enemies here and there, and it does seem like we do have a few unique ways to go. Of course, with most of the familiar enemies that we've seen in the movies, they mostly appear in flashback form as to not come off as a weird rehash or retcon to the franchise, and it almost gives it full hope of it being canon. But unfortunately, with some of the conflicting pieces coming around, and let's not forget that Stuart Little 3 would come out a couple years after the animated series came out, and the reason why that was animated was because Columbia unfortunately was no longer able to produce a budget that would have allowed for live action animation to be put into a motion picture. On top of that, they ended up going with a direct-to-video release as yet another way to save money. So, computer-generated imagery plus direct-to-video release stature simply makes for Stuart Little 3 to be essentially a full bypass project, and it thankfully played its part in helping to keep the budget a little lower. But I have talked about Stuart Little 3 before. I can understand that not many people were into this one as much as the others, but I sure was. I could argue that Stuart Little 3 is better than the others because the main antagonist seems to get bigger and fiercer every time. I mean, we've gone from a group of cats to a falcon to a freaking mountain lion. Yeah. If that's not impressive enough, I don't even know what is. But nevertheless though, there's not too many big things about the animated series that I can say otherwise, though I will at least give a notch to the animation. The animation was mostly put together, thankfully with a budget in mind, and while there unfortunately wasn't that much of an effort as a means to get another movie made after Stuart Little 3 came out, we do at least have plenty of ways to make long-lasting memories, not just with the show, but with the movies entirely. And then of course we could talk about the other media that's been made over the years, like the video games, the books, the cassettes that they had. Yeah. Kind of odd that they would have those, but still. Not everybody was into CDs. Other than that though, I enjoyed this series, and I'm sure a lot of people will feel the same way just as well. It's got a good episode selection, and it thankfully didn't feel very monotonous in spite of how it kept on going with the same premise every time. And by the end of the show, it did seem like steam would have run out to a point in which that it would have felt redundant and possibly disliked by fans. So it's good that they didn't try to top the movies with what they were able to accomplish here. At the same time, it seems like kind of a bummer that we no longer have much of a franchise like this. Live action animation does have its ups and downs, mainly with the expense in mind, knowing many other films like it. But still, Stuart Little has its place in Hollywood and in animation. And I feel like those are two big rewards that could be given in any way. So, with that in mind, this rounds up for this weekend, and I will say I didn't have much for last weekend in terms of TV shows that deserve the spotlight episodes, but that's mostly because I've had a lot of business to take care of with other things in mind, outside of YouTube, outside of work, and other such things in mind. So, I will of course have movies to watch, as I might throw in a few of them for bonus episodes, and I will have more TV shows to talk about soon. So make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.